related to political economy. So Helios.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Thanks for sticking around for the last talk. I might be a little incoherent. I've just arrived from the States and came straight here. So this is joint with Barsanetti. And we're going to talk today about something else, something different, politics. For a start, though there will be some decision theory in there of sorts, but the whole thing about politics is that then we want to aggregate and see aggregate results of these decisions, which are electoral outcomes. And so things like elections that happen in Brazil, the Bolsonaro election, the Trump election, I live in the UK, so the Brexit vote, were surprising to many of us, and there's a sense in which many of us think they were wrong, in a sense that we didn't correctly make that decision. The decision of information missed something, as if a lot of people didn't vote correctly. And there's a big question about whether new media played a role in this. And there's been a lot of articles, even in Brazil, about the role of new media in influencing the way people voted and giving a lot of biased news one way or another. And so that's what we're going to try to talk about in a model and see how this new media could affect elections. In fact, there's a plethora of new media now. Once upon a time, in the UK, there used to be the BBC. At 8 o'clock, everybody watched the BBC, or Rai, my country in Italy, and the 8 o'clock news in the networks in the US. I'm sure you had the same thing in Brazil. But now, these traditional media remain, but there's a plethora of other media we can read, especially from the internet. And so this is just an illustration for the US of the plethora of media we have from the left and from the right. So you can pick and choose here very much what you really like to follow and fine-tune, and you're not constrained to 8 o'clock news that are. So there's a plethora of new media. That's the first point. The second point, and this is more a US kind of point, but maybe it applies also to Brazil to some extent. There's a big asymmetry, and this is between left and right wing voters on the trust they put on media. So in America, one of the clearest differences on opposite sides of the aisle is that large portion of Democrats trust many more media, a large, great number of media. If you look at a picture like this, you see trust in media from the left and from the right. So the right is red and the left is blue. And you see, the trust really in the last 5 years expands here. And there's a big dichotomy between 68% of left-wing guys that trust in general media and 11% on the right that trust media. So there's a big distrust on one side of media. Okay, this is this part of the rhetoric of politicians that helps that. Trump helps that, I'm sure. Bolsonaro promotes a lot of distrust of media, and I'm sure you're familiar with that. So that's the second point. And so we're going to try to build a model of thinking about these two things. One is a lot of media you can choose from, and distrust that is differential on either side for media. So think of it this way. Think of it, there's two types of information that everybody gets, just to simplify things. One is the outside world, okay? So you get media from maybe mainstream sources or official media. There is media that you are involuntarily exposed to, okay? The outside. And then there's media that you actually choose, okay? So I choose an American, I choose to read Fox News, and I like that, and that, forms my beliefs on stuff, but I'm also exposed to other media somewhat, which I may distrust to a large extent, but there's also the outside. So this is the whole model, if you want. There's my beliefs about who to vote for will be made of two things. One is the outside world news that somehow hits me, and I may not believe it or hit me more or less, and the media I select. Okay? Based on these two signals, I'll form my opinion and I will vote. And each one of us, depending on where we are, will be exposed more or less to the outside and choose a particular media that influences us. And based on these two pieces of information, we will vote. Okay? That's it. That's the whole model. And so the theoretical question is the following. Citizens on the left and on the right are exposed to, or trust, if you want, outside media very different. Okay? So left and right, maybe the right trusts much less the outside news than the left. Okay? You can think of it, the right, they live more in the country side, and the urban, or in general, exposed to news where they live on the left. Knowing that people, besides this differential exposure, they also choose the media they like. Okay? They also choose to be their Fox News. Can the wrong candidate, and I'll say what I mean by wrong, win an election in this media environment? Done. Yes?
And the mainstream is correct in some well-defined sense?
Correctly?
Is the mainstream part is correct or objective in some well-defined sense?
Okay, very good question. I'll have different versions of what I mean by mainstream, but I'll say they are unbiased for now. Okay? They may be incorrect, but on average, they are unbiased. Yeah. But, yes. So the media is endogenously chosen, but it's non-strategic in a sense. There's the whole idea is this whole plethora of media out there. Okay? And you choose the one you want, and there will be the one you want out there because there's just so many. So the media will be non-strategic, demand-driven. Very good points. And the whole idea behind this is that, well, I said, let me see. Yes? It's not a good mic. Oh, wow, this is a much better mic. Let me keep it for. Wow, I feel a rock star now. So, okay, so here comes the decision theory part or behavioral assumption that is novel. Well, there's a few things that are novel. This is certainly a big part of it. So we assume political identity. This paper is called Identity-Based Election, right? And we assume people feel that they are on the left or on the right. They are, because of their upbringing, their culture, their tradition, right-wing or left-wing. Okay? And so they will make the choice of in media, the one they want to, if they choose Fox News, for example, they will choose it because with this objective, so that whatever news they receive from that, they will update rationally, but they will choose the source with a certain bias so that as often as possible, they will keep believing they have their heart in the right place in terms of their political faith. So if I'm a Trump supporter or a Bolsonaro supporter, I will choose a certain media that would tell me as often as possible, convince me exposed, given the news that it gives me, that I am right to be a Trump supporter. By I am right, I mean I will update rationally all the news I receive. So there will be no cognitive bias here, okay? And so I will choose a media that has a certain slant that makes sure that as often as possible, I believe I made the right choice. Okay, yes? What?
Is my mind also accounting for the fact that I'm selecting information?
Yes, your mind will know the bias, will know.
So I know that I'm getting a selected sample.
Yes, yes. And so you could think of it as two selves. I have a heart that is pro-Bolsonaro, and I believe he's right, and every news I receive, I'll update correctly, but I might choose certain sources that are biased in a certain way, and I will know they're biased, but I will choose them so that as often as possible, I believe rationally that Bolsonaro is right. And so how does this, well, the premise of this comes from a lot of political science. My paper is based on this identity-based polarization book, which says these two sides, the hearts being Republican or Democrats, have become very tribal and very strong in America, and many countries even here have become very polarized and have become a major thing to identify with. Okay, so you don't identify in terms of race, ideology, in terms of, religion or sorts. You identify really as a Republican or a Democrat in the US very much, and maybe here too, you are pro or against Bolsonaro. It seems like these polarizations similar. And so the whole gist of this is that political affiliations determine what type of information you absorb, rather than the other way around. You know, the information you absorb makes you determine your affiliation. No? This is kind of this guided information. Okay, so there'll be different parts to this model coming to your question here. So the first part of the model, I'll talk about unbiased. The outside world is unbiased. So it will give you a news that is, unbiased, so it's just more or less noisy, okay? And then I will talk about a model where the outside news is biased. And this could be talking about the outside news as maybe another country like Russia or Hungary, or, where, the leader controls the mainstream media and the mainstream media sends a biased information, okay? And then I can talk about misspecified models in which maybe the people think that the mainstream media is biased, but it isn't biased. This is very true in America, for example. A lot of Trump supporters believe that the mainstream news is biased, but it isn't. So that entails another type of a cognitive problem because you're misunderstanding the actual process, okay? All right. So, yes?
Here, why do you need to have in your model these outside media instead of having just like a lot of different menu of other medias? Like, what role does it play having this?
The outside media.
Yeah.
Right. So I just want to say, I want to capture the fact that there's media that you choose and you fully trust because that's what you choose to read. Okay. But you're also influenced by something outside, something that you don't choose, that you're exposed to, and that keeps reality in check, in a sense. And I want to capture the fact that some people really distrust anything that's from the outside. You really only believe your Fox News, and everything outside you don't trust at all. And maybe some others have more trust on the outside. That's what I want to, this asymmetry I was trying to capture on the trust of media, I put there first, belongs to the outside media. Right? I put that asymmetry in levels of trust, and that's what I want to capture. And that's the main asymmetry I want to see what happens in an election when there's one side that really is in its bubble and listens only to Fox News almost, and the other side that's more open. Yes? No, it's exogenous. It's exogenous. Okay, so the literature quickly is, the paper is very simple, and it touches upon some papers here that look at correlation neglects. There's some very quoted papers that are from very famous people here in the audience that talk about how people aggregate what happens to elections if you aggregate information, getting two signals like I do, but not understanding that these signals are correlated. They come from the same source or from a similar source, and you update, so you have a cognitive problem because you don't update correctly, okay? And so they want to see how that cognitive problem comes out into wrong electoral outcomes, because it's correlation neglect, okay? Very important aspect there. In that sense, it's very similar because we also have two signals. We update, but our model, we update rationally, so you know the cognitive, you just choose the media in a certain way. The preferences we have are behavioral and similar to these models have utility in beliefs. The most similar one is this Kozegi paper in which there's an agent, it's not about elections, he's choosing whether to do a high-skilled job or a low-skilled job, okay? And he has to acquire information about his type. Am I a high-skilled guy or a low-skilled guy? But he wants to think he's a high-skilled guy. He prefers to believe he's a high-skilled guy. And so he acquires information about his type, okay? But he acquires information sequentially, and if he gets a signal that tells him you're a high-skilled type, he's happy with that and he chooses the high-skilled job. If the signal tells him you're a low-skilled guy, he keeps acquiring another signal and another signal because maybe that signal tells him he's a high-skilled guy, and so then he switches. So there's a bias. So maybe this is similar to how we do empirical work, and we don't find an asterisk and we keep looking, right? But this, in the end, the guy updates rationally on all the signals he receives, but biases the search. Okay, so exposed, he'll update rationally, but he has, this sequentiality biases the search. We don't do this sequential search. We choose, so the update will be rational in our model, just like in these models, but we will choose the media, the different plethora of media, in using Bayesian persuasion in a way that I'll explain, okay? And then it touches upon media models, but in these media models, media is strategic in our model. Media is just all out there. So the model is very simple, very, very simple. There's just two parties, right and left, two states, right and left, meaning one is correct, one's not, and if R is the state, the signals are going to come out of the R distribution. Okay. There's a common prior, it need not be common, it need not be uniform. Let's keep it like that for now, because that makes it perfectly symmetric, and I want to capture other asymmetries. And there's two types of citizens. My heart is right, my heart is left. Okay? And so just take the R citizen, it's a purely decision theoretic problem. There's no gain here, there's just aggregation. So the R guy is taken as an example, okay? And so he will choose the in media. What is in media? He's got all this plethora of media out there, okay? All that picture I show you with the bubbles. There's all these media out there you can choose, and you will choose one of them that best suits you to preserve your political identity. I'll explain what that means. But what is a media? A media in this model is just, say, a two-dimensional variable that tells you what the bias is. And the bias is a two-dimensional object. In this case, it tells you how often you say R, the signals R when the state is R, and how often you say left when the state is left. Okay? So there's a two-dimensional object there, and each media has a certain characteristic of how biased it is. So maybe Fox News tells you R always when the state is R, and then tells you also R when the state is L a lot of the time. And then maybe it tells you L when the state is L sometimes only. Okay? So this is one type of media. okay, which will be very slanted towards R. And you will update correctly based on it, because you'll know it is slanted, but this is just one type of media. And you can imagine another media that tells you, you know, sometimes R, and here sometimes left. There's all these combinations, and that kind of represents that bubble I showed you at the beginning, okay? So each media, you know, that has a certain characteristics, because you know Fox News has this type of reporting, and I model it as a certain type of, you know, media bias. And so you can assume the media as a sender with commitment, if we want to use the Bayesian persuasion language, right? It's a sender with commitment. You know it follows that rule, okay? So that's the way I interpret the media. Okay, and then the outside news, as the question came, for now, I'll assume it to be perfectly symmetric. So everybody's also exposed to some outside news, mainstream news, whatever you want to call it, and but people, and so this is perfectly symmetric news. So in the state R, it says R and LL with the same probability, so it's symmetric. But one side will be more exposed or more trusting of it. And I'll model that as having a higher precision, TL, than the other side, okay? So I hear some news, or I follow some news from the outside, and so I'll update more based on that than the guys from the other side, because they are more in their bubble, they don't listen, they don't trust. Okay? So there's two signals. One I choose, one's the media I choose with a certain bias that's endogenous, and I choose it subject to knowing that I'm exposed somewhat to the outside world, and knowing that I trust the outside world, or I listen to it to a certain extent. And the extent is different from the two sides. Okay? Yeah.
Conditional on choosing the signal, am I now like give them the same weight as the objective one or not? If I chose a signal, I give them the same weight as the objective one?
You will choose a signal structure, you'll give it the same weight. Yeah, there's just, that's right. So let me say this. So suppose you're an R citizen, okay? You know you're exposed, or you trust the outside news with weight TR. So you will receive an outside signal with precision TR. You know that, conditional on the state. And you will choose your in media, Fox News or whatever, which is a certain type of biased, in a certain way, a certain style of biased second signal structure. You'll give it the same weight in this sense. I don't know if I'm, okay? And that's it. You'll just receive two signals from the in media, from the outside media. You'll know the signal structures. You'll update rationally. You'll have a posterior. And you'll maintain or switch your political faith based on that. Okay? And that's all. So you'll stay for Trump, or you'll stay. So suppose you get two negative signals, you probably switch against Trump. And you'll know this signal structure. One, this is exogenous, and this is the one you choose. Yes? Intensity in preferences or in information?
In preferences.
Relative to what? I mean,
I like to be, right wing, left wing, or.
Yeah. So for now, yeah. So we don't have it originating that. We could, but we just say you're just right wing or left wing. Okay. We could add some independents that don't have that. Okay. Okay. So everybody then chooses its in media, knowing it's somewhat exposed to outside media, gets two signals, finds out the posterior is rational. You update, maintain or switch your faith, and then we'll assume, we can have other assumptions here though, that you vote where your posterior belief is. Okay, so if my belief is more pro-Trump, I'll vote for Trump. Even though I don't like, maybe, if I'm switching, then I don't like it, but I will vote the other way. Okay, so here comes the main preference. So this is a pure faith preservation motive. So the utility is, so you'll choose your media structure so that after you are exposed to the outside world and the Fox News that you read, your chance that you believe Trump is correct, if you're a Trump guy, is at least a half. Okay? So you get a 1 if this happens and a 0 if not. So if you maintain your faith, you're happy. If they tell the media you read, after all, tells you the media is wrong, you're unhappy and you'll vote for the other side. Okay? This we can relax. You need to be 1-0, but there needs to be something going on at 1/2, a little jump or some slope or something. Okay? But the key thing is that why are you choosing to read what you read? Because you want to try to make sure, be convinced that your guy is the right guy. This is not different from me I support Barcelona, and I like to watch it in the Catalan channel that reports things and makes me feel good about the team, even if you lost. And, reports things with a slant, and I'm happy that, and gives me tells me some information and not some other. And so that's why we model why people read certain things. Right, yeah.
Oh, so what happens if my utility is just my posterior? 1 minus or plus posterior, depending on my... So this is very discrete. It's very discontinuous.
Right, so there has to be some jump at 1/2 or some slope at 1/2.
So it's linear, linear
Perfectly linear doesn't work. Okay, this is because we're using Bayesian persuasion. Essentially, there has to be some jump. We formulated this thing as a utility. Okay, the payoff comes from the preferences, but it could come from actions. You could say, I will get a utility of 1 if I vote for Trump. And I will vote for Trump if I believe it's more likely than not to be right. And I will vote for the other guy. And so that's predicated upon actions and not utility, and those are naturally discrete. Anyway, this is, okay. So this is the, that's it. Okay, these are the preferences. I explain you why people read what they want to read. They'll be exposed to the outside world, and all I'm going to do, if there's no question, just solve this and aggregate and see what happens. And I have 10 minutes. Okay, so that's just in time. Okay, so I will solve this now, and I say, okay, we start from a common prior, 1/2. Okay, we don't need to, just simpler, and it's 50-50. At 1/2, we're exposed to outside world with some news, with some noise, okay? It's how much we trust it. And so that means we will receive something that tells us Trump is better than 1/2 or worse than 1/2 after that signal. We'll be more positive or more negative after that outside news signal. And given this, knowing this possibility, that's how we will choose our inside news, Fox News signal. So I will explain the inside news signal now, and the same will be for everybody else. So I start from 1/2. If the outside news tells me good, I'm happy. I'm confirmed that Trump is good. If it tells you minus, I'm not happy, and so I'll try to get news that pushes me over the edge here. If I trust more outside news, the outside news will push me more positive or more negative, so I'll have to try to react differently from it. And so that's the main difference, right? Okay, so here, in this case, what you have is that if after the outside news is good, then I'm fine. It's when it's bad that I worry. And so if the outside news is bad, then I'll try to choose a signal that when it's good just pushes me here over the edge. And when it's bad, and to do this as often as possible, I'll have to combine it with a news that when it's bad, it's terrible. Okay, this is standard 101 Kamenic against Bayesian persuasion, if you heard of that model. Anyway, you try to target this and push you over the edge as often as possible here, and then you combine it with this T that pushes you down intensely but rarely. And so this is a media signal that's one-sided. It tells you Trump is good most of the time. But then you know it tells you Trump is good also when it's bad, so you don't update too much. But then when it tells you it's bad, it's terrible. So if Fox News tells you Trump is bad, it's as bad as it gets, right? So that's the combination. The other combination that's possible, though, is this one, which is when you're more exposed. And so here you'll get good news. You want to react to this guy and push it over the edge. But it's very costly to combine it with a terrible signal like before, because you'll have to do it too often. Instead, you can exploit the fact that when you get good news from the outside, you will be way off, and so you can combine it with bad news. You'll have to have good and bad news from the inside, otherwise you don't update. It'll be good and bad, and the bad won't be too bad, but so it can still keep you on this side of the half when it happens that the good news from outside is there, okay? So this is like a hedging strategy, which is different, is like more mixed in a sense. And this comes out if you do also the convex hull arguments that are typical in this literature. And so essentially there's two qualitatively different signals. There's one side, a signal maybe Fox Newsy, that tell you, R when the state is R, but also R when the state is L, and so you don't update very much, but so favorable news are frequent, so there's diluted the baby one, but when they're negative, it's terrible. So very biased, one-sided. And there's more two-sided news that you could choose that are more mixed, that are more good and bad in either state, and they're less one-sided, okay? So these are two qualitatively different. Of course, there's all the quantitative differences too in there. Okay, so this is the main result here. So in these two slides. So first, this is the precision of the outside news. If you are perfectly exposed to outside news, then there's no persuasion you can get from the inside news, because you're perfectly exposed, you have a perfectly informative signal, and so you'll be happy when the signal is positive, 1, you'll be unhappy when the signal is negative, 0. And so you'll be happy 50% of the time, and so there's no persuasion given that your priors are half. As T drops though, you'll be more and more persuaded. You'll be convinced that your guy is correct and vote for him more often than not, and it'll be more and more effective as this goes down. Okay? But here you see that the blue GB signal, the two-sided, is better for more exposed or more trusting people, and the red is more effective for people with less trust or less exposed or more closed up, more in the countryside. Okay. Okay, so this is the persuasion. Of course, if you're perfectly closed up, you will always be persuaded because you're essentially in a total bubble. And okay, so let me skip this. So this is the main slide here. So this is again that same line unconditionally. So it tells you how often you're happy because the media cocktail that you're exposed to, that you partly chose, preserved your political faith. But this is what happens in the two states. You know, this is the average. In the good state, this is how often you'll be happy. In the bad state, this is how often you'll be happy. And here the same with the other good and bad state. Okay? So that's that. And now I want to say, okay, so now let's go back to the first slide. One side is very closed up, very distrusting of outside news. It'll be here. Okay? You'll choose red. And the other side is maybe average here, and you'll choose blue. Okay? But now suppose blue is the correct state. So no Trump or no Bolsonaro is the right state. That's where signals come from. Okay? So what will happen is that this guy will go here, will be persuaded this often, and this guy will go down here. Right? But if you mix them, depending on the parameter values, you can get that this guy even though he's in the bad state, the fact that he's closed up and he chose this Fox News channel makes him persuaded more often, 96% of the time, than this guy that is correct but chose more an average signal, less biased, that on average works better than the other side, but then in this state works worse than this guy. So these guys here convince, our side convinced these guys 96% of the time, and the L citizens that are right only 94% of the time. So if you aggregate this situation here, what you obtain is that R wins all the time. When it's wrong, by a little bit. When it's right, by a large percentage. So regardless of the state, Bolsonaro wins, or Trump wins. And this is in which situation? In a situation in which these fans are pretty closed up, and the other fans on the other side are mildly trusting outside news as well. So first point is that there's a winning margin advantage for the closed side. Yes, okay, obvious. The other side, the other thing that's important is that this advantage can be enough to win symmetric elections all the time. And so L loses even when it's the correct party. So there is no information equivalence. So I cannot talk about welfare here, really, because the preferences are weird. Okay, so but I can talk about information aggregation because people are updating rationally their signals. They're perfectly updating their signal as known. Okay. If there's correlation between signals, I cannot say they win always, but I can say it wins most of the time, even if it's wrong. Okay, so if there was no outside news, so when there was only the BBC, and we had not all this choice to target media, we would have a perfectly symmetric outcome. Even if one side distrusts the BBC much more than the other, it doesn't matter. That aggregates into a perfectly symmetric situation. Some guys get more noisy signals, some guys get less noisy signals. There's no choice. They cannot fine-tune their media, and so correct outcome always perfectly symmetric. The whole point is that when you choose your media, you can choose it in such a way that even if you update rationally, the wrong guy wins. And a lot is determined by the fact that these guys choose blue, that it's better ex ante, rather than red, that is worse exposed. Okay? So, you know, if these guys were choosing media in a way to say, oh, we shouldn't choose blue, we should choose red, because, you know, those guys that are reading Fox News are very extreme, we should choose something more biased as a response, then that would work. That would work, that would defeat it. But I don't think that's what people do. We don't read the New York Times because we want to defeat them. It's just an individual pleasure that we have into reading, and in my model it is about us, you know, thinking that we are on the right side as often as possible. Okay, how much time do I have? It's almost over. 5? Okay. And so, but this looks like a very small region. So of all the region here, this is the trust of one side, this is the trust of the other side. Almost everywhere there is information aggregation. The region where there isn't is where one guy is very distrusting and the other guy is average. Okay, so this is the region when R always wins. The other regions are correct guy wins. Okay, you need one side very distrusting, very closed, and the other guy average. Okay, so if you move here, you will see if this is more trusting or less trusting, there's also a correct information aggregation, correct guy wins. Yes?
Could we interpret, could we interpret that as like if this traditional media loses quality, such a thing that more likely to happen?
Yes, if traditional media or trust of the left drops or increases, then we could have information aggregation again, and maybe that's interest of politicians. Also, if these guys increase their trust, and so there's an incentive for these guys to be low if you're on the R side. And so that's obviously what Trump or Bolsonaro try to do. seed distrust of traditional media. Okay, so then we can have a lot of extensions, no? We can say, okay, if these guys do not understand correctly the signals, if these guys getting the same signal with the same precision, but thinks it's more imprecise than it is, so distrusts incorrectly, doesn't matter, that doesn't change. If the average is not 50-50, it's even unfavorable to Trump, he can still win all the time, so it's not knife edge. Maybe the one I like best is, you know, we can have, I said we have the same priors, but we don't need to have the same priors, especially maybe I'm a Trump guy. I don't believe they're 50-50 to start, maybe he's 60% right, and the other side believes they are 60% right. Suppose you have that, then the result is emphasized. So the region where this reversion happens is much larger, because there's a lot of guys that are already convinced here, regardless what happens, and the other guys need more convincing, and so there's a much bigger region relative to here where R win always, so it becomes more pervasive, this failure of aggregation in the whole space. Okay? So anyway, I'm going to wrap up, and so all I want to say is that the different exposure from outside media drives quantitatively and qualitatively different media that we pick and choose. But it's the qualitative difference in the media that we pick and choose that can drive on aggregate very skewed electoral outcomes, and you can have Bolsonaro winning and you wonder why. Well, that's a consequence of what type of media they picked, and given that the fact they're very exposed, combined with what media the other side picked. Yes?
To assume that your heart is also perfectly correlated with your precision of your outside signal. Say, you know, Bernie Sanders voting, and you also completely in your body. And in that case, you would get something which is like U-shape, right?
Yeah. So I'm just basing myself on the original graph on the trust of the left versus the trust of the right. That's very, on average, different. But then there could be fringes. But yeah, there's just two hearts, and assume one side is more distrusting, much more distrusting than the other. Okay. I can talk about propaganda, but there's the same model you can do in a totalitarian state where the media outside is propaganda, and people can be on the government side and also choose their media, or on the opposition and choose their media. And I show that you really need censorship there. So if you don't have censorship on top of propaganda, propaganda is easily defeated. And so you can see why a lot of these totalitarian governments like, you know, Putin or Orban don't want to have other media to choose from, because you can defeat very easily in this model the propaganda, okay? If you can choose your own media on top of it. Lastly, the last thing I'm going to say is that there's a model of misperceived propaganda. So suppose there is no propaganda, so the outside signal is symmetric, as before, but one side believes it's biased against them, right? Which is what we see a lot in me. So if you have that, so it's a misperceived model, people are cognitively impaired beyond having their heart in a certain place. This doesn't matter, you get the same type of graph. If the R believe the outside signal is just biased against them, it still works. The same flavor of the result where R always wins in this region remains. So the same kind of punchline is there. Okay? So very simple. Two information sorters. The outside we're all exposed to somewhat. We believe it or not. We believe it's biased, but it's not. The inside we can choose in partly to shield against this outside news if it happens to be unfavorable. Elections just aggregate information based on this decision theoretic thing in which we are choosing one media and we're updating rationally on two signals, and the goal is just to understand the difference on this differential distrust in the two sides. And the result is that the low trust on one side and average on the other combination generates this failure of aggregation where one side wins all the time, whether it's right or whether he or she is wrong. Thank you.
So for your result, you have to play with this. So for your result, you have to play with this this plenty of media, right? So you can choose, right? So there is no regulation in a way, right? So regulation on the type of you know. Suppose you think, I don't know how much you can incorporate that, fake news or some kind of warning about this. So do you have any idea what regulation this term could change things, or?
Yeah. So a lot of the results are based on the fact that there is this whole space of media we can choose from which used to not to be there, right? And now we can really pick and choose the media with the bias we want and fine-tune it. I want to say this is not a model about fake news. I don't know how to think about fake news. People are just getting a signal that has noise. And maybe you know that it's biased more on one side than the other, but you're not fooled by it. You just update correctly and reverse engineer the bias it has. So there's no, it's not a model of fake news, right? And I'm thinking, but there is fake news in this world, and I'm thinking about how we could model it, or what it would be of fake news. Maybe it has something to do with misperceptions when we maybe misunderstand the structure of the signal and we update incorrectly. But I don't know, so this is, as it is, it's not really...
So some media is going to push you towards more the right state, and the other push you towards the wrong state. So it's the fake news could be something like related to that distance, right? How much you are using a media that is against the truth.
Yeah, but it could also be called, I don't know, precision. So I don't know. I don't know where the boundary goes from imprecise to fake. I don't know. Yeah.
From a political economy point of view, and I agree that your model doesn't get any normative consequences, except that sometimes it says that the right guys is never elected. Well, your model. So it could be that actually, coming back to my previous question, that it could be not. It would be optimal to have actually on both sides extreme guys that are isolated.
Yeah. So if both sides are isolated, then at that point, the persuasion is better, and the two sides become symmetrically, essentially asymmetric. The whole point is that what that asymmetry can get you. That's the exercise, essentially. And if the asymmetry is big, one side's almost distrusting, and the other guy is average, that's when you get the thing. Yeah.
So I know that you said that like the utility is not very meaningful, so you can't do welfare comparisons. But looking from a social choice theory perspective, when you have these kind of preferences, do you know if there is some literature like what is the best way to aggregate them when you have preferences that are not like exogenous? They depend on what kind of media do you choose.
You should ask the decision theory experts in the room, which I'm not. I didn't want to go into that exercise of welfare because it's just, it takes some assumption on what. Well, I guess I could do it. I could say it would mean. Well, it would require more assumptions. Maybe I have a welfare effect based on who I believe is right, and then there's another welfare effect on who's actually elected, because that's also would affect my utility of sorts. So there'll be more assumptions I need to make, whereas information aggregation is just simple. It's just people are receiving two signals, they're updating. All this wealth of information that's out there, is it giving me the correct outcome? That means the signals come from a state W, R, or WL. Do we match it or not? So it's just a simpler concept. But you can define welfare, but I feel I would need more structure and more assumptions.
Yeah. Also, you're opening a lot of doors to potentially funky things, like that maybe we don't want to elect the best person because the right-wingers will be more disappointed. Then, you have to adapt reality. So, once you open the welfare door, if you use traditional Lincoln tools, that's a dangerous door to use here, right? So I think it may be safer to...
Yeah, I'm happy to keep it closed, yeah. Especially,
One thing that I didn't understand it, if you consider the mainstream media neutral, it's neutral in your model?
In the main model, it is. Then there's the propaganda part, which assume it's biased because it represents an authoritarian state, official media.
If mainstream media is neutral, why people distrust them?
Well, well, that opens a big door.
Because to me your model is not realistic on this point, because if some people are really distrust on a neutral media, it is something wrong with your model.
Well, look, I mean
that you didn't talk to us, but you.
Okay. So this is an assumption that I have, and that's my premise. Okay, so that's my model. And now you say, is that a justified assumption? And I can tell you, well, look, there's this differential distrust here in the data. And now you ask me why. And I can tell you, look at this. For the US, this is Trump. There was already an asymmetry, but Trump comes in, boom. You see here, this is Trump saying, to me, this is not about my models, just to answer your question. This is Trump saying, and he's been saying that explicitly, and maybe Bolsonaro's been saying the same. I'm not as knowledgeable of Brazilian politics, but he's been sowing distrust of the media and generating this thing, which helped him in my model. That helps that their side is distrusting of the outside, because then they're more in the bubble and more persuadable by the source they do choose, Fox News, for example.
Can I criticize your paper?
Yeah.
You have two lines, very different. So the mainstream media are agreeing with that people in the above the midline. Eh? So we have people disagreeing. So the mainstream media that you assume neutral is not neutral, because a lot of people are agreeing with that and disagreeing with the let's say Trump supporters. So to me, just this graph is saying to me that the mainstream media is not neutral. Just seeing this figure,
It may be.
Maybe.
It may be.
Yes.
It may be. Or it may not.
So to me, why not to model just in the two different sides, because it looked like old wine in new bottles. What did you do? So why not just assume that mainstream media is not neutral, and assume that mainstream media is liberal side?
I have. Okay, so that's the propaganda part.
Okay.
Okay, so, but I call it propaganda, and I apply it to a non-liberal democracy, but maybe you're very welcome to say, no, that applies also to current liberal democracy.
Okay.
But, so yeah, so what that media, what you're saying is consistent with that. It could be. It could be.
I don't have a question, but I want to use this time because we are about to finish.
Yeah.
To thank the organizer and everybody for a fantastic conference.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, so let's clap for the talk. And
Thank
thank you
you,
everyone.
Berto.
Thank you.